Unanimous consent authorizing the chair to declare recess during the hearing. Yeah, I ask unanimous consent that the chair authorize to declare recess at any time during today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. For members participating remotely, I want to remind you of key regulations from the House Committee on Rules. Members must be visible on video to be considered in attendance and to participate unless experiencing connectivity issues. Members must also continue to use the video function for the remainder of the time they are attending this meeting and hearing, unless experiencing connectivity issues or technical problems. If a member is experiencing any connectivity recess issues or other technical problems, please inform the committee staff as soon as possible so you can receive assistance. A chat function is available for members on the Cisco WebEx platform for this purpose. Members can also call the committee's main phone line at 202-225-4472, 202-225-4472 for any technical assistance by phone. Members may not participate in more than one committee proceeding simultaneously. However, for security reasons, members may maintain connection to the software platform while not in attendance. It is the responsibility of each member seeking recognition to unmute their microphones prior to speaking and to keep their microphone muted when not speaking to avoid inadvertent background noise. Should I hear any inadvertent background noise, I will request that the member to please mute their microphone. As the chair of today's committee and hearing, I will make a good faith effort to provide every member experiencing connectivity issues an opportunity to participate fully in the proceedings. And finally, to insert a document into the record, please have your staff email it to documentstni@mail.house.gov. Okay. So I'll now go to the opening statement, and I'd like to say good morning to all the members in attendance. I'm honored to kick off the first subcommittee hearing of this Congress as the new chair of this subcommittee. My district and my state are widely dependent on reliable rail service, both passenger and freight. As such, I'm a major advocate for passenger and freight rail, not just in New Jersey, but across the nation. The work of this subcommittee is critical to protecting the safety and security of rail passengers and employees during and after this global pandemic. That's why we need to be forward-thinking about safety in order to avoid the types of preventable accidents that cost lives and harm the environment. With the mandate to install positive train control systems finally complete, I hope to see widespread safety improvements in the industry. In this subcommittee, we will explore the ways that we continue to improve these safety improvements. In addition, we will review the need for disadvantaged businesses enterprise programs within the rail space. We hear a lot about ensuring equity in transportation, and it's time to turn that talk into actionable programs. But the critical component for the future of rail modernization, it will lead to gender safety improvements as well as more effective passenger transportation. Also, I want the subcommittee to explore the numerous ideas for high-speed rail. When I look at the gap between the United States and the rest of the world, I see potential. I'd say that there are many opportunities for high-speed rail in the U.S. I remain determined to steer substantial federal investment towards the U.S. rail systems to expand rail opportunities that broaden our economic base. Last year, Chairman DeFazio ushered H.R. 2 through the House, investing $60 billion in U.S. rail systems. I supported that bill, and the subcommittee is already redrafting a rail title for surface reauthorization in anticipation of a major infrastructure push this year. We will get this done, and rail will be front and center. Today's hearing is the next step in that effort. I'm determined to highlight the importance of rail in today's complex surface transportation system. The title of the hearing is Full Steam Ahead for Rail: Why Rail is More Relevant Than Ever for the Economic and Environmental Progress. This is a throwback to the old steam engines that dominated the rail industry over 100 years ago. Too many people discount rail as a bygone era, but I don't think they understand that the value that rail currently brings to our nation. So we need everyone to understand the benefits that rail provides. I hope to hear today's witnesses highlight the economic and environmental advantages that rail is responsible for. I want to learn more about the economic advantages of moving freight over the rails. I want to learn how we can increase the number of jobs rail transportation supports nationwide and how we can sustain the quality of these jobs. Finally, I want to hear about the many ways rail can significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions and further our nation's fight against climate change. I hope the members of this subcommittee get a better appreciation for the importance of passenger rail and freight today. Now I'd like to call on the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Crawford, for an opening statement. Your mic up.
Other one. There we go. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to congratulate you on your assumption of the leadership position in this subcommittee and look forward to working with you in this Congress. Our hearing today will examine the economic and environmental benefits of our robust American rail systems. Railroads have always been an essential part of American economic development. They support a variety of industries and moving goods to market at home and abroad, including manufacturing, energy, and agriculture. Studies have found that the investments made by rail have supported approximately 1 million jobs and $219 billion in economic output. Rail is also considered one of the most fuel-efficient ways to move freight. On average, freight rail can move 1 ton of freight over 470 miles on 1 gallon of fuel. Freight rail's output of greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. are some of the lowest, at less than 1%, and make up only 2.1% of overall transportation-related emissions. During the COVID-19 pandemic, freight rail proved to be resilient and invaluable carriers of essential goods when they were needed most. Freight rail's significant contributions during this difficult period should be noted as we look toward future infrastructure investments. As the committee works to advance its surface transportation priorities, I hope it considers how we can leverage the important value of the rail industry. In particular, we must ensure that freight railroads keep growing in an uninhibited manner so that Americans can continue to benefit from their irreplaceable contributions to our economy. Thank you again to all of our witnesses for being here today, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Now we'll call on Chairman DeFazio, Chairman of the Overall Committee, for a statement.
Thank you, Chairman Payne, and again, congratulations on your first hearing. This is timely and of tremendous importance. Examining how we can move people and freight more efficiently without congestion, and how we can also at the same time be dealing with climate change and fossil fuel reduction. We've already heard some statistics from the ranking member on the efficiency of rail. I did make the mistake once of saying to one of my constituents who owns a very large tug company about how rail is the most efficient way to move freight, and he corrected me that actually it is on the water, but water doesn't go everywhere that the freight and passenger rail network can go. But this is a very, very exciting time for rail. I'm particularly looking forward to hearing from Virginia. They're doing something that we proposed in last year's Invest Act, and that is to look at a problem. Massive, massive congestion, 95 coming into DC down through Virginia. And they looked at it and said, wow, it'll cost us about 10 or 15 billion dollars, to add lane miles, and we'll add lane miles, and then more people will hop in their cars, and we'll end up being congested again in 10 years. So he said, well, there might be another solution. And then they began to look at rail investments, particularly with a new bridge over the Potomac River, a big choke point. Now, this is expensive, but it turns out that it's actually more cost beneficial and actually solves the problem as opposed to temporarily delaying the problem with congestion in this particular corridor. Now, this isn't going to be applicable everywhere in the United States. I mean, it's most applicable in very, very heavily congested areas like the Northeast or around other major urban areas in the country. According to Amtrak statistics, traveling on the electrified Northeast Corridor system emits 83% fewer greenhouse gas emissions than driving and 73% fewer than flying. And Amtrak has pretty much taken over the market from DC to New York. They used to run a Delta shuttle every hour. I think someone else had a shuttle at the same time. So we have seen a dramatic reduction in carbon pollution, and people like traveling by rail. You're not strapped in a little crummy seat. You don't have to deal with all the hassles of going to the airport and doing that. And that's even with all the problems we have in the Northeast Corridor. With ancient, decrepit infrastructure. The Baltimore Tunnel, built in 1872, beautiful engineering work, made of brick. It's raining inside the tunnel because of leaking water mains that are 100 years old. Someday a tunnel's going to collapse, going to cut off the Northeast. We need to rebuild that tunnel as well as make other major improvements on that line. And also look, around the country where we can facilitate better movement of passenger rail in cooperation with freight. That's what's so exciting about the project we're going to hear about from Virginia. CSX came to the table and with VDOT, and they worked out something that is going to benefit both freight movement, which is way more efficient than trucks, and passenger movement, a win-win. I'm hoping that the rest of the industry is attentive to this because the law does say, because we took over the common carrier status and passenger rail from the railroads, that Amtrak's supposed to get preference, but certainly out my way, where it takes about 3 or over 3 hours to get from my home city of Eugene to Portland, 112 miles. Train can go 120 miles an hour, takes over 3 hours to get there. We have to see better coordination, cooperation between the industry and freight, and that's why it's so exciting to have this hearing today. We'll hear from Bnsf, And hopefully, we can be working on projects like this around the rest of the country as we move forward and as we build back better. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity.
No, well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We appreciate your leadership in this area. And I'd like to remind members in the committee hearing room to wear their mask at all times, including while speaking. Thank you for your cooperation in this matter. I would like to welcome the witnesses on our panel. Ms. Sharon Valentine, Secretary of Transportation for the Commonwealth of Virginia. Karen Kraska, President and Chairman of the Arkansas and Missouri Railroads. Mr. Greg Reagan, President of the Transportation Trades Department of AFL-CIO, and Mr. Tom Williams, Group Vice President of Consumer Products, Bnsf Railway. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to your testimony. Without objection, our witnesses' full statements will be included in the record. Since your written testimony has been made a part of the record, the subcommittee requests that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. We will first hear from Ms. Valentine. You may proceed.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman DeFazio. Thank you for those opening remarks from Virginia. Chairman Payne, Ranking Member Crawford, members of the Rail Subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on behalf of the Commonwealth of Virginia and our $3.7 billion Transforming Rail in Virginia initiative. Under this program, the Commonwealth will construct a bridge over the Potomac dedicated to passenger rail, acquire 386 miles of rail right-of-way and 223 miles of track, and invest more than $1 billion in infrastructure over the next decade. Our purpose? To expand and improve passenger, commuter, and freight rail, establish a pathway to separate passenger and freight operations, and create a vital link in our national rail network by connecting the Northeast and Southeast corridors. It was an honor to announce this innovative partnership with CSX, Amtrak, and the Virginia Rail Express, VRE, in December of 2019. Over these past 14 months, Virginia has worked diligently and deliberately to finalize all agreements to complete this multilateral initiative. Why is Virginia investing in rail? So the Northern Administration has prioritized projects that will move as many people and goods as possible across all modes of transportation in an equitable and environmentally sustainable manner. It is a multimodal approach to creating an economy that works for all people. One of the worst rail bottlenecks mentioned by Chairman DeFazio along the East Coast is at the Potomac River between Virginia and DC, and it's called the Long Bridge, which is owned by CSX. The bridge carries all passenger, commuter, and freight rail, nearly 80 trains a day, and is at 98% capacity during peak periods. Due to these constraints, Virginia has been unable to expand passenger rail service, even though demand prior to the pandemic was reaching record highs. At the same time, Virginia has been engaged in corridor planning studies, one of which was the I-95 corridor, which, as you all know, is heavily congested. Even today, as we emerge from this pandemic, traffic has returned to 90% of pre-pandemic levels. Through the study, we learned that adding just one lane in each direction for 50 miles would cost $12.5 billion. While the cost was staggering, the most sobering part of the analysis was that by the time the construction was complete in 10 years, the corridor would be just as congested as it is today. That finding is what led Virginia to rail, a mode that could provide the capacity at a third of the cost. With a willing partner in CSX, the Commonwealth reached out to Amtrak and VRE to join us in this unique opportunity to be phased in over 10 years, which will double Virginia-supported Amtrak trains, providing nearly hourly service between Richmond and DC, increase VRE commuter service by 60%, lay the foundation for a Southeast high-speed rail corridor, and create the potential to expand rail to all parts of our Commonwealth. Equally important, this is being done in cooperation with the host railroad, increasing reliability and capacity for both freight and passenger. We are working collaboratively with CSX to create that win-win. And as we create this opportunity, we are also moving more goods and people in an environmentally sustainable way. According to APTA, rail travel emits up to 83% fewer greenhouse gases than driving and up to 73% fewer than flying. In addition, a study by George Mason University estimates the construction of a new Long Bridge will generate more than $6 billion in additional economic impact in Northern Virginia and the greater Washington region each year. Benefits can also be measured by increased access to jobs and improving the quality of life. The new service plan includes late night and weekend service because many essential jobs are not 9 to 5 Monday through Friday. That is why we work to add trains leaving Washington in the late evening and on weekends, matching train schedules to the reality of our economy. A commitment of state and regional funds, $200 million in VRE funding, and $944 million in Amtrak funding, the Commonwealth has been able to produce a $3.7 billion financial plan. With additional funds, we could fully build out the Washington to Richmond corridor, upgrade an east-west freight route, and develop the S-line that will cut travel between Raleigh and Richmond by 90 minutes.
Please
If you
wrap,
continue
please
to
wrap up.
deliberate, I will. I ask you to consider a capital program. In closing, I will just say that I really thank you for this opportunity and I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much. Next, we will hear from Ms. Kraska. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. I am Karen Kraska, President and Chairman of the Arkansas and Missouri Railroad, speaking on behalf of the nation's 600 Class II and III railroads. These railroads operate in 49 states, over nearly 50,000 miles of track, or approximately 1/3 of the nation's railroad network. In 36 states, short lines operate at least 1/4 of the state's rail network. New Jersey is one of the 10 states where short lines operate more than 70% of the state's rail network. My home state of Arkansas has 23 short line railroads. 28 of the 33 members of this subcommittee have a short line in their district. Short lines are most often associated with small town and rural America, but they also serve large urban areas in many of the nation's busiest ports, including Miami, Los Angeles, Long Beach, Hampton Roads, New York, and New Jersey. Short lines operate freight traffic over 2 of the busiest commuter rail corridors in the country. The lexicon of railroading permeates American vocabulary. While many of those phrases carry a negative connotation, he was railroaded, the project was a train wreck, the talks were derailed. I much prefer your committee's selection from that lexicon, full steam ahead for rail. That phrase captures the attitude of short-line entrepreneurs endeavoring to preserve and grow what began as the nation's most vulnerable railroad infrastructure and what is today a huge American success story. For those of you new to this story, let me give you 4 defining characteristics of today's short lines. Most short lines operate track that was headed for abandonment. As money-losing lines, they received little capital investment by their previous Class I owners. To be successful, short lines invest up to 33% of their annual revenues in maintaining and rehabilitating their infrastructure. As confirmation, you only need to talk to Chairman DeFazio, who for years made it his personal mission to put together the millions of federal, state, and local dollars needed to save the Coos Bay line. For large areas of the country, short-line railroad service is the only connection to the national railroad network. While my Arkansas frozen poultry shippers cannot complete the journey to West Coast ports for export without Class I service, they cannot start that journey without short-line service. Flexible local service is a key driver of our success. We deal face-to-face with our customers and can respond quickly to their needs. For example, my railroad serves Georgia's facilities in Arkansas and Missouri. They need feed corn for poultry and lots of it consistently. When the local harvest is good, they truck the corn from local sources. But when the harvest is not, the customer needs to shift gears, so they turn to us to bring in unit trains of corn from grain-producing states. Short lines are small businesses. Our combined annual revenues are less than the annual revenues of any single one of the nation's 4 largest Class 1 railroads. Before I talk about what short lines can do, let me take a moment to thank you for what you have already done. The members of the T&I Committee, past and present, played a critical role in making the short line rehabilitation tax credit permanent in 2020 so that it will continue to help us rebuild our infrastructure. It is, as you suggest, full steam ahead for rail, and your support for the tax credit has given us a full head of steam as we move forward. For that, we are most grateful. My fellow railroad panelists will highlight the substantial economic and environmental benefits of the railroad industry writ large. I will put a short line spin on some of those. For thousands of communities across the country, short line rail service is the only connection to the national railroad network, and this connection is an economic lifeline. Short lines lower transportation costs for shippers. One rail car holds the equivalent of 3 to 4 truckloads. For example, on my railroad, a shipper's cost to move a ton of freight 54 miles from Butterfield, Missouri to Springdale, Arkansas is approximately 1/3 the truck rate. The environmental benefits of rail transportation have been well documented. You will hear those statistics from my Class 1 colleague, particularly with regard to fuel efficiency, and those statistics also apply to short lines. We do not know what programs you will be considering in an infrastructure bill, so my written testimony touches on how today's programs can best be used by short lines. I also list a variety of general principles that will maximize our ability to make the best use of whatever programs you end up including, be they current or new. I appreciate the opportunity to present the short line perspective and would conclude with a personal observation. I am a businesswoman running a small business, and I do not pretend to understand the pressures, processes, and politics that govern your world. I was, however, involved in the decades-long effort to extend and then make permanent the short line tax credit, and I learned an important lesson from that experience. Regardless of party control, and often in the face of fierce partisan battles, our chief congressional sponsors never wavered in their commitment to sticking together in bipartisan support of the legislation. It showed me that government works when you work hard at working it out. We need that today more than ever, and I hope that can be the spirit in which you approach creating a much-needed infrastructure package. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Kraska. Now we will hear from Mr. Reagan for 5 minutes.
Thank you. On behalf of the Transportation Trades Department, AFL-CIO, and our 33 affiliated unions, I want to first thank Chair Payne and Ranking Member Crawford for inviting me to testify before you today. I also want to recognize that this is Chair Payne's first hearing since taking the gavel. TTD and our rail unions are looking forward to your leadership on the subcommittee and working together on an ambitious pro-rail, pro-worker agenda. The railroad sector is one of the most storied industries in American history. From the founding of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad in 1827, the laying of the first transcontinental railroad to today's best-in-world freight network. The rail industry has been and continues to be a core driver of the American economy and a way of life. For decades, railroad employment has provided a path to the middle class for millions of Americans due to strong collective bargaining agreements and high union density. While the total amount of employees represented by a union has unfortunately decreased, representation remains strong at railroads. As a direct result, rail employees continue to earn good wages and benefits, even as economic progress has stalled for many. These are good jobs. These good jobs are not only found on the coasts or in major cities. In fact, there are railroad employees in every single congressional district in the United States, whether urban or rural, coastal or inland, Midwest or deep South. Importantly, these jobs are accessible to everyday Americans. Most railroaders do not have a college education, but through rail employment have become highly skilled and earn compensation that significantly outpaces average wages for high school graduates. As the U.S. economy has changed over time and various industries have risen and fallen, jobs on the railroad continue to be a path forward toward a financially secure livelihood and a dignified retirement. The industry also creates good jobs outside of the railroads themselves. Two shining examples of this are the manufacture of Amtrak's new Acela train sets by machinist members at Alstom's Hornell, New York plant, and the construction jobs associated with rail infrastructure projects like Gateway and new high-speed rail systems. These employees power a key economic background for our economy. Most recent data shows that Class 1 railroads alone generated approximately $219.5 billion per year in economic output. In FY19, Amtrak carried 32.5 million passengers, including 820,000 trips per day along the Northeast Corridor, moving a workforce that contributes more than $50 billion annually to the national economy. While the economic impacts of the rail industry today are impressive, we must continue looking toward the future. For example, intermodal traffic is increasingly a key source of business for the freights, but we also know that rail connectors and on-dock rail at our nation's ports and harbors are badly lacking, leaving revenue and good jobs on the table. On passenger rail, for years we've fought for improvements on Amtrak's Northeast Corridor and to preserve Amtrak's national network, which connects many of Amtrak's rural destinations. Amtrak is our national passenger rail carrier, and we will continue to advocate for its existing services, but we also believe that there is room, opportunity, and frankly, demand for expansion to cover new and underserved destinations, as well as new and innovative high-speed rail enterprises. I hope that Congress will support these new frontiers of passenger rail service and to provide the appropriate federal investments, labor protections, and procurement requirements necessary to expand passenger rail and meet service demands and open new markets. In relation to both freight and passenger rail, my fellow panelists have discussed the environmental benefits of the railroad industry. To maximize these benefits, Congress, rail employers, and manufacturers must act to leverage the developments and procurement of new green technologies to create good jobs. They must work in partnership with rail employees when building and deploying these technologies to best promote safety, reliability, and interoperability. While there is a bright future for rail and its workforce, we must maintain the promise of the industry as a meaningful sector of good jobs capable of elevating employees to the middle class. However, today we sit at a critical juncture for the future of railroads. As noted in my written testimony, employment in Class 1 railroads has fallen precipitously and rapidly. Recent reporting shows that employment in Class 1s has hit its lowest levels in at least 10 years. And in just the last few years, these railroads have cut approximately 25% of their entire workforce. These rapid changes in the industry are not due to sudden obsolescence or deep declines in revenue, but rather they're due to maximizing profit margins. However, operating on such thin headcounts has and will continue to have negative impacts on safety, the railroad's ability to serve its customers, and the existence of good jobs and long-term health and viability of the sector. Freight, passenger, and commuter railroads represent an integral component of our economy and our efforts toward a greener future. It is our hope that today's testimony shine a greater light on the importance of this industry, and we look forward to working with you to secure that position for decades to come. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today.
Thank you, Mr. Reagan. Now we will move on to Mr. Williams for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and good morning, Chairman DeFazio, Chairman Payne, Ranking Member Crawford, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me today to discuss BNSF's perspective on the economic and environmental advantages of freight rail. I currently serve as Group Vice President for the Consumer Products Business Group at BNSF. Consumer Products is BNSF's largest business unit, consisting of domestic and international intermodal freight. And including our automotive business, it represents more than 50% of the freight volume moving on our railroad. BNSF transports on average about 15% of all intercity ton miles of freight that move in the United States, and does so safely. We've made significant safety progress in partnership with our employees, and also by continually exploring and investing in innovative technologies that help make the railroad safer, more efficient, and more sustainable. Despite the pandemic, our railroad handled more than 9.5 million carloads, trailers, and containers of freight last year. BNSF reinvests significant capital into our network each year to safely and efficiently handle these traffic volumes and to position our railroad for growth opportunities into the future. Since 2000, BNSF has invested more than $70 billion back into the railroad. Rail has historically and will continue to play a critical role in serving the nation's freight transportation needs. According to the Association of American Railroads, rail accounts for more than 40% of long-distance freight volumes. There are significant economic and environmental advantages to moving all kinds of freight by rail, but this morning I'd like to focus in particular on the value proposition of rail intermodal. There's a good reason for the continued strong growth of intermodal across U.S. supply chains. It's the most cost-effective and environmentally efficient mode of transporting freight. Intermodal combines the strengths of different transportation modes to yield an efficient total movement of the goods that Americans use and rely on every day. Rail's role in intermodal is critical. For perspective, one BNSF intermodal train can carry up to several hundred containers and trailers of freight, removing that same number of trucks from our nation's highways. The resulting safety, economic, and environmental benefits are compelling. Utilizing rail is now widely recognized by our customers as an effective strategy to achieve significant carbon emission savings in their supply chains. BNSF has even developed a tool to aid our customers in quantifying the environmental benefits of rail by estimating the carbon footprint and savings when shipping on our railroad. Over the past decade, BNSF has helped our customers and the nation avoid more than 80 million metric tons of CO2 emissions. EPA data shows that freight rail accounts for just 2% of transportation-related greenhouse gas emissions. So just the fact that rail exists in its current form creates opportunities to reduce emissions in supply chains. But beyond just relying on this inherent benefit, BNSF continues to work to increase the efficiency of our network, to maximize our competitiveness in the global marketplace while minimizing our impact on the environment. This includes utilizing the latest fuel optimizing technologies and improving locomotive efficiency, with BNSF having the largest number of the newest and cleanest burning locomotives in North America. We're also actively pursuing other means to reduce our carbon emissions and utilize more sustainable technology in our operations. For example, we're currently partnering and testing a battery electric locomotive, an initiative which builds on other BNSF investments in and commitment to sustainable technologies that were outlined in my written statement. These include the use of battery electric hostler trucks, the deployment of zero-emission electric wide-span cranes at our intermodal facilities, and the broad rollout of intermodal automated gate systems, just to name a few. In closing, freight railroads are poised to play an increasingly important role in meeting the growing demand for goods movement in the U.S. The economic and environmental advantages of rail, supported by significant private capital investment and ongoing innovation, will help maintain U.S. competitiveness and position the country to play a leading role in sustainable transportation. And finally, as I highlighted in my written testimony, smart public policy decisions can help all of these goals. Thank you for this opportunity to address the committee, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. I will now move on to member questions. Each member will be recognized for 5 minutes, and I will start by recognizing myself. Secretary Valentine, in your testimony, you highlight the Long Bridge, built in 1904, as one of the worst rail bottlenecks along the East Coast. The bridge carries all passengers, commuter, and freight rail along the corridor, moving nearly 80 trains a day with a capacity of 98% during peak hours. In response, your state is building a new 2-track Long Bridge for $1.9 billion to serve passenger rail leaving the current bridge for freight. Removing this bottleneck along the corridor will improve passenger rail capacity and on-time performance from Maine to Florida. Another bottleneck along the East Coast is the Hudson River Tunnel tubes. Like the Long Bridge, it only has 2 tracks built in 1910 and moves up to 24 trains an hour, over 400 trains a day. Building a new Hudson tunnel is one piece of the most critical infrastructure projects in the country. It's called the Gateway Program. If one of the Hudson Tunnel tubes fails, what is the impact to passenger rail in Virginia, almost 400 miles away?
Well, Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the question. I will say that, many of these projects are all looking at the choke points along what is really a system. No rail system, very few, and at a state or jurisdictional boundary. So the improvements that we're able to make here in across the Potomac, here in Virginia, we open that capacity to expand existing rail. It allows us to expand to additional rail to places that are underserved. We are making a dedicated passenger rail connection between the Northeast and the Southeast corridor. Um, Reliability and the performance of the system so that those in the Southeast and those in the Northeast can benefit from these investments. The investments made in along the entire corridor, whether the Gateway project, among any others, all of these investments support our rail network. That is how we see all of us working together, supporting each other to really create a true national rail system.
Thank you. Mr. Reagan, providing everyone with access and opportunity for employment is an important issue for me. Your testimony states that the rail sector offers a path to skilled work in the middle class, even for those who do not have a college degree. We need to grow these types of jobs exponentially. But you caution a downward trend in the overall railroad workforce. Is that trend a result of the COVID pandemic? And if not, then what is the cause, and what recommendations do you have for growing the railroad jobs and expanding opportunities like those described in your testimony?
Thank you for the question. The pandemic, certainly we saw a dip in railroad employment early in the pandemic, but that does not explain certainly the drop in employment at the Class 1 railroads. We've seen a very sharp decline over the last few years, and one that is a result, frankly, of a shifting in business model towards a focus on quarterly returns from in terms of shareholder returns. And it is one that frankly gives us a lot of pause. It's one that we think has a negative effect on safety, a negative on operations. And we look for, frankly, we're looking for a way to make sure that we continue the steady upward trend of freight rail in a way that will grow jobs, continue to serve the customers, and ensure that we have a sustainable future for freight.
Thank you. And trying to be a good example, I will yield back before my time is over, and we will next hear from Mr. Crawford for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to ask Ms. Kraska, how has COVID-19 pandemic affected short line railroads, and are there anything policymakers here in Washington can do to help short line industry better respond to the pandemic?
Thank you for the question. The COVID experience has impacted the various short lines in many different ways. I have been affected differently than other local railroads. So there's no strict one answer fits all, as is typically the case. Initially, we experienced a significant drop in freight. We had guaranteed our workers 40 hours, so we provided that to them. We reassigned them to do other jobs, and we wanted to keep our payroll the same. And basically, we have seen a fair amount of recovery, although some railroads have not. In terms of what can be done, training, providing jobs, it is difficult to hire right now for me, and I'm looking for more people. So guidelines as to how to handle COVID, training programs for the workers would all be very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I may get back to you with another question, but right now I want to ask Mr. Williams. You mentioned in your comments the need to innovate. Can you talk about that a little bit, flesh that out a little bit more? What can Congress do to address your need, your desire for the rail industry to innovate?
Well, I think about innovation supporting three specific objectives that ultimately help us being more competitive with our customers. The first always is safety. So any innovation that would help us more safely operate our network and protect the safety of our employees. And the second is efficiency, and then finally environmental sustainability. And we're in a very competitive marketplace, and so innovating in ways that help us be more efficient, so that we can grow, which is going to be good for our employees in the long run. But it's also going to be good for the employment of the supply chains that rely so heavily on freight rail and their employment bases, and ultimately the competitiveness of the U.S. and the global economy. So we want to be innovative, and in terms of help, making sure that we've got a level playing field with other competitive transportation modes, so that we're able to advance both process and technology on the same level that our competitors are doing in their space.
Thank you, I appreciate it. Let me go back to Ms. Kraska. It's my understanding that short-line railroads make considerable investments in rehabilitating and maintaining their own infrastructure. How does this investment translate to jobs and local economies? And you mentioned that you are actually looking for more employees, and can you kind of talk about that a little bit, and the rehabilitation and maintenance of your own infrastructure and how that would impact that?
We
I think you're muted.
Sorry. It keeps clicking back and forth. We have a maintenance of way team that we use to do operating, which is general maintenance, and capital projects, which is the more expensive projects that we undertake. To the extent where maintenance is general maintenance, we have our crews, but sometimes when we do the larger capital projects, we're unable to support that ourselves in terms of the fluctuation in manpower, so we will hire contractors. We have those relationships with people. Right now on property, we have one contractor working on our bridges. So we are staffed and ready to do that work, but there are some types of workers where we're having difficulty hiring, whether it be for lack of interest, since we're willing to train, is not necessarily lack of a skill set. So I hope I have answered your question, but if not, please.
No, that's perfect. Thank you. I appreciate it, and yield back.
Okay, well, thank you.
Okay, the gentleman's time has expired. We will now go to the chairman of the full committee, Chairman DeFazio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Williams, during your remarks, you mentioned electrified locomotive. I'm curious. I mean, of course, there are some historic lines where we have very long electrified railroads. Historically, the infrastructure no longer exists. Would this run off a catenary or be self-contained?
So thank you for the question, Chairman DeFazio. And the technology behind our battery electric locomotive test is a little beyond my scope, but I would just say this is a test in partnership with the manufacturer that we're going to do within the state of California. And it does have the potential to expand as a lot of our efficiency, environmental, and safety initiatives over time. They start with tests in a specific region, and if successful, just as PTC rolled out broadly across the railroad after a significant amount of testing, that's the potential. But in terms of the specific technology, we'd have to follow up with your office on that.
Great. Yeah, I would recognize that. I think you were the first to fully implement PTC. Congratulate you on that. Obviously, you're a bit more innovative than some. Ms. Valentine, how did you get CSX to the table? I'm approached by people in Texas and, in my state and elsewhere trying to deal with, like, I'm going to say names, Union Pacific, and they never want to come to the table.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It really shows the power of a discretionary federal grant. Back in 2016, it was the beginning of the infra grant program, and the Commonwealth had applied for funding. We did receive some funding, about $165 million. $45 million of it was for rail. And it was really through that discretionary grant that we received that we were in discussions with CSX and Amtrak. And those funds actually have morphed into what is now our $3.7 billion initiative. So those discussions have been going on for a while, seriously for these past 2 years, working with the railroad. How could we make rail more efficient for both of us? And that's how it was launched.
So just a little bit of federal investment.
Yes. Well, yeah, the power of bringing us together.
Okay. All right. Well, we're going to see if we can replicate that model. Mr. Regan, would you want to comment on PSR a little bit?
Sure. This is a rising trend within the industry. It's one that we see a lot of negative impacts from the employment perspective. We also have concerns about safety, about encouraging cutting corners when it comes to maximizing profits. And it is something that's become widespread among the Class 1 railroads, and something that is frankly disconcerting for us, and one that we think there needs to be some oversight from the federal government to make sure that we are that whatever business model is being implemented is done so in a way that continues to manage both the common carrier obligations of the freight railroads, as well as making sure that we're continuing to operate in a safe manner. And that is at our core, making sure that our members are operating these railroads in a safe way, both for their own safety and for the communities they operate through.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of the Frank Lorenzo days when he destroyed Eastern Airlines. And it's, I have concerns. We certainly had a lot of customer complaints on the first experiment with CSX. I think we're still getting some, but it's gotten better. But I am concerned, particularly when we have some railroads running trains as long as 3 miles, and they want to go to a single crew for a 3-mile long train. I asked the former head of the FRA under Trump, like, well, if the train broke down in Albany, Oregon, and it's blocking every crossing through the city, means no police, no fire, no ambulance. How long is it going to take the engineer to walk 3 miles from the front of the train to, say, the second car from the rear, which is having a brake problem? And he said, well, I don't know, hour. There's some real concerns here that we have to pursue. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. No further questions.
Thank you, gentleman. Yields back. Now we'll hear from Mr. Davis.
Hey, Mr. Chairman. First off, I want to congratulate you on your chairmanship. I told your predecessor, Chairman Lipinski, that I wouldn't miss him, but I would miss him. But since you're chair, I don't miss him anymore. And I hope somebody reminds him of that too, because I will if you don't. But I also want to recognize your efforts in Colorectal Cancer Awareness Month this month, of what you've done to really affect the fight against that disease that killed your father and affects my wife and my family today. So I appreciate your leadership, your friendship, and your partnership in that arena, and I'm looking forward to working with you on the subcommittee and also Ranking Member Crawford. So thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Well, thank you, sir. And I have to go to another committee hearing, so I'm just going to talk real quick about my One Federal Decision Act. It's a bill that I've introduced. Hopefully it would be part of any infrastructure push to put the environmental review process at a 2-year maximum time frame. I am going to have to yield back my time to get to this other hearing, but I would prefer if the chairman would allow them to Ms. Kraska and also Mr. Williams to be able to make comments on the record about how a shorter review process and that maximum 2-year time period process could impact the short lines and also the BNSF. So with that, I yield back, and I hope Mr. Williams and Ms. Kraska can respond to that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. The gentleman yields, and now we will hear from Mr. Moulton. What? I'm sorry, let's hold on. Would you like them to respond on the record? It's still your time. Yes, sir. Would the two witnesses respond to Mr. Davis's questions?
Yeah, this is Mr. Williams. Certainly, having a timeline for environmental review and giving us more certainty into that process would help us. Our objective is to be able to expand our network as our customers expand their need and they're growing their supply chain. So if a retailer builds a new distribution center, they're going to need a little bit more rail service over time. That's going to require us to incrementally add capacity to our network. And so having more certainty around that permit review process would enable us to better keep up our pace of investment with our customers' needs.
This is Karen Kraska. I agree with everything that has just been stated. I would like to, my perspective is somewhat different, being a much smaller railroad. So the comments that I have, one, revolve around the uncertainty created by the length of the process. I don't necessarily know at what point in time a project will start and if in fact the expected duration will be what I anticipate or not. Probably more concretely, there are impacts on cost. A longer time frame means, what has been the impact of inflation? What will the costs be? If you then look at it and what we've experienced with COVID, potential supply chain locations and disruptions. Will the things that I've needed still be available, or will I have a 6-month waiting time? Further to that, if you have a circumstance where the scope of the project has changed because the asset has deteriorated further, you could in fact have a higher cost and a reevaluation of the process and the work that needs to be done. Finally, a longer process could suggest that there are in fact additional studies and costs associated with completing that particular project. And that's an unknown, and particularly as a small business, that is an undesirable outcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we will go to the gentleman, Mr. Moulton, for 5 minutes.
Chairman Payne, congratulations on your first hearing, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. Last May, I released a white paper on the role high-speed rail can play in rebuilding the U.S. economy, not just from this pandemic, but building back better for the future. And in December, I introduced the American High-Speed Rail Act. So, Mr. Chairman, I would like to submit my white paper, American High-Speed Rail and Rebuilding the U.S. Economy, for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Having worked myself on a short line in New England, spent some time working for Burlington Northern Santa Fe, and then serving as the managing director of Texas Central's high-speed rail project between Dallas and Houston, I understand how important your work is for the American economy and how much potential it holds for our future. So to all the witnesses here, thank you for your work in doing what you can to bring our rail system in America up to par with the rest of the world. We do some things really well, and many nations admire our freight service, but as several people have already noted, our passenger rail is pathetically behind the times. And that just points to how much opportunity we have for the future. We shouldn't think of high-speed rail as something that just exists in the Northeast Corridor, or perhaps in the Northeast Corridor or California, because high-speed rail has the capacity to connect many different parts of our country, and in particular to connect smaller cities that have not taken such a leading role in the tech economy of the last 30 years to larger cities that they lie between. And that's important when we think about how we bridge the divide that exists in so many ways in American society today, but particularly between those who are thriving in our coastal cities and those in other parts of the country that in many ways feel left out. Secretary Valentine, I'd like to start with a question for you. When you pursued this project in Virginia, you and the chairman have both noted how it was so unusual to look at this transportation problem and say, rather than just build more highways, we should look at what other solutions might be on the table. If you step back and think about this for a minute, this is pretty extraordinary because it's the only logical way to address a problem like this. We don't address communications problems by simply saying, how do you solve it by improving a telephone network? No, we look at all the options that are on the table, including new technologies that are coming online every single day. And yet in America, and uniquely in America, we try to answer every transportation bottleneck by just building more highways. So tell us why that is the case, why that's been the case in the past, and perhaps you could explain some of the obstacles that you encountered in doing things in a totally sensible way to approach your problem, but in a way that was nonetheless quite unusual.
Wow, I really appreciate that question. Thank you. In Virginia, we have really made a commitment to a multimodal transportation system. It's incredibly varied from the Port of Virginia, rail metro transit, 66 airports. We have a spaceport over on Wallops Island. So we really have made that commitment to this. As we have done this, we've really begun to look at corridors, full corridors, and it really began at looking at the I-81 corridor in the western part of Virginia, 325 miles, looking at what are the operational technology improvements that could bring multimodal improvements, just looking at what we could do to target solutions. $4 billion of need was identified. We are managing to address $2 billion of those needs, but we're trying to do it in a very managed way. That program is actually what led to future corridor studies. That's how we began to look at 95, look at 66, and that is how we're approaching transportation in Virginia. With limited resources, how can we find the right solution? And that is the approach we took on 95. When we looked at the other options, they were either unaffordable or ineffective, which is worse. And so that's really what led us to this.
My time is almost up, but if I could ask a question for the record, and would very much appreciate your response. What are some of the obstacles to doing this that you've encountered? Why is it that this is so unusual? It's such an unusual approach, when really, if you think about it, it's just a sensible approach we should all take. How best to solve a problem, not how do you solve a problem or how do you fit a particular solution, i.e. adding lanes to highways, to whatever transportation problem that we have. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. We'll now hear from the gentleman, Mr. Weber, for 5 minutes.
Test, that'll do it. Ms. Kreska, this will be for you primarily. On short line railroads, do you have the figures of the percentage of employees to those SLRs as to be compared with the regular complete lines? And I will tell you why. Hold on one second. What I'm getting at is with the pandemic hitting, what is it determinable what percentage of employees were put on hold, lost their jobs, if you will, with the SLRs versus the major railroads?
You might be on mute.
Yes, I was on mute. Apologies. I will need to get back to you with that specific bit of information, but what I can tell you is that, you know, at least information on the SLRs, no employees have lost their jobs as a result of COVID with me, though. So I can see if I can find some industry figures, but I'll have to get back to you.
Okay, that'd be great if you get back to the office. And then, do you have a gauge of how much, without the, not everybody has a railroad that goes right to their back door, obviously, thus the need for SLRs. But do you have any idea of how much, was there a time when SLRs were not available for the major railroads and there was a freight holdup? Any facts or figures on that?
Again, I'll have to get back to you on that.
Okay, I'm just trying to gauge how much the pandemic has done. You guys do a great job, and of course, I have 5 ports in my district, more than any other member of Congress. Some have 4, but we have 5 there on the Gulf Coast of Texas. A little bit of and I'm an air conditioning contractor by trade, 35 years on my company, so a little bit of a technical question. Do you know if any of the locomotives or any of the train systems or office systems, has any of the HVAC, the air systems, been redesigned because of the pandemic?
Are you talking specifically about me and my structures, or are you talking about on equipment?
It
Could
would be
please
you
clarify?
and your structures, and I would assume maybe the locomotives as well, or the trains themselves. Of course, I realize y'all have basically locomotives into that part. But in your offices, have there been any technical changes in the air distribution systems? Do you know?
We have in fact done that in terms of what upgrades the HVAC vendors provided to us in terms of filters, and I guess there's some various technologies that we availed ourselves of to do that, in terms of, we have some, business cars, the like, and the office buildings. The locomotives per se, I'm not aware that we had done anything in particular, but again, we can get back to you on that.
Well, thank you. There is a system that eliminates microbes and and bacteria and all that kind of stuff that people can buy for their homes and office buildings. I just didn't know if that had increased y'all's operating cost, if you would look into that. And then again, any idea, would you say that your revenue had dropped, I don't know, 10%, 20%, 5%, your job availability of moving product, slowdown, reduction, any idea on that percentage?
We're a privately held company, so those figures are not disclosed, and generally not available to anyone but shareholders. Having said that, at the outset, our revenue dropped precipitously. By the end of the year, we had seen a rebound, and we were basically what I would consider flat with the prior year, but the prior year also had some downflows as a function of the fact that we had flooding. So I consider my operation an aberration in that we did fairly well considering everything that had happened in the industry. And there were other short lines that were hurt very, very dramatically and much more significantly, 50% plus.
Wow. Well, thank you for that. And Mr. Chairman, I appreciate you being here, and I yield back.
Thank you, sir. Next, we will hear from Mr. Cohen for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and the ranking member, Mr. Crawford. Appreciate your having this important hearing. And I'd like to talk about regional passenger rail vision programs. It's important for passenger rail, which I've enjoyed from early in my life to now. I'm a big fan of Amtrak and passenger rail. And so one way to get that going is through regional rail commissions. There's a Southern Rail Commission that covers Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. There needs to be more. because I think they can highlight the need for transportation throughout a state. Memphis has got hopes of having transportation to Nashville, could connect to Knoxville and even to Chattanooga, and make travel to all those cities much more feasible rather than automobile. We used to have nonstop air traffic to all those cities. We don't have it, even out of Memphis, which is formerly a hub. So it's not an easy flight, and rail would be so much easier. We've also got interest in going to Little Rock. We've had looked into that in the past. Memphis is one of only 2 cities in Tennessee, Nashville the other, that has passenger rail service. There should be more, and we need a second train going up to Chicago. And we consider that Cairo stop one that train could come down here. So we're looking at regional rail, and the Southern Rail Commission kind of as a guide for us. Ms. Valentine, what are the limitations that are being able that are to organize and implement and invest and expand interstate passenger rail service to connect communities across the country? Are there limitations that you've experienced?
You know, I am familiar with a bill that you have that certainly you recognize many of the limitations. One being that passenger rail has been undercapitalized for years. And so how do we make those kinds of investments? In the Commonwealth of Virginia, we do have dedicated funding for rail, but it is still a small percentage, and we're working on building it up. Two, that planning for rail often extends beyond the term of an administration, either at the federal government and at the state level as well. So making those longer term commitments is really important. And then the collaboration it takes, because a rail system often crosses jurisdictions. The Commonwealth sees the part that we're playing right now in constructing a bridge dedicated solely to passenger rail, is opening the capacity, unlocking the gridlock there so that rail can be expanded. It's going to create redundancy. The closest rail connection is 70 miles away. I always say as the crow flies, because it would take longer to drive over to Harpers Ferry, West Virginia, but we're creating redundancy. We're opening up the Northeast and Southeast corridor, and we're creating a path to separate passenger and freight rail for the Southeast corridor. We're a member of the Southeast High-Speed Corridor Coalition. We believe that this is a critical start to this, and we're building on many of the recommendations that have come out of that. So that kind of collaboration, I believe, is fundamental for us to building out. What you have articulated are the needs for increased connectivity.
Thank you so much, and good luck with your projects. Mr. Williams, you talked about intermodal corridors or intermodal facilities, and Bnsf has probably one of the largest ones here in Memphis. Is there a need for improvements along Lamar Avenue or coming into Lamar to make Bnsf even more successful with its intermodal corridor?
Yeah, and that facility there in Memphis was actually where we deployed, and you probably know this, I think among our first electric wide-span cranes. So the ingress and egress to intermodal facilities is very important. I'm not familiar with a specific issue on Lamar Avenue, but would be happy to follow up with your office because truly intermodal is a part of an integrated supply chain. And so it's not just the rail operations that are important, but also the last mile delivery and the trucks that are getting into and out of facilities very efficiently. That's also very important.
So if we did, in the past, there have been concerns that we needed some widening of Lamar to make the trucks coming in from Mississippi facilitate their entry into the facility. That would be helpful for BNSF, and would you all participate in any kind of a program as a public-private partnership?
Well, because of the broader community benefit, I would see that as a potential for public-private partnership. But again, I'd want to get into the specifics and get a better understanding on exactly what the ingress and egress issues are there on Lamar Avenue.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired.
And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Will do, Congressman Cohen. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Next, we will hear from Mr. Stauber for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Payne, and congratulations on your new position, and to Ranking Member Crawford for holding this hearing. You know, we talk about the importance of railroads and shipping our goods across this great nation, from our agricultural products to our finished goods to coal to LNG and taconite in my state of Minnesota, northern Minnesota. Taconite is shipped by rail to the docks in Duluth, which is the port of Duluth is the most inland port in our nation, and those taconite pellets are shipped to make United States steel products. And I want to thank the rail industry for keeping these products and the goods moving across our nation during this pandemic. And you know, people wouldn't have the food the industry has provided across this nation, and really the farmers wouldn't necessarily have had the markets for their commodities. So I have a few questions for Ms. Kraska. What are the biggest obstacles that you could see coming out of this committee that could impact your business and make it harder to operate?
Unmute.
Increased regulation is always a challenge for us. A personal one, and forgive me, this may or may not be the purview of this committee or subcommittee, but truck size and weights, an increase in those could dramatically tilt the difficulties we have in competing with truck. In terms of other areas, in terms of the grant programs, we would like a fair shake in terms of our opportunity to apply and have it work through that with us. You know, if you look at infra, I mean, and some of the other programs, the ability to perhaps not partner with another entity to get them done. I believe as a whole, we try to do a fair job. We try to do, fair isn't the word, a good job, and try to do what is right for our communities, our workers, our customers. So things that impact that will make it harder for us.
Thank you. And one last question to Ms. Kraska again. You know, when thinking about liquid natural gas, what are some of the legislative obstacles that you see arising, and how can we ensure that they do not impede the transport of affordable, clean energy?
That is not something that I am very familiar with. I would think, though, as a whole, given that the industry handles a lot of sensitive, dangerous materials, that the requirements can be put in place so that they can be handled appropriately. And I think that can be done.
All right, thank you and thank you all to all our witnesses for their testimony. It's greatly appreciated. And I will yield back, Mr. Chair.
I'd like to thank the gentleman for yielding back. And we will now hear from the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Sirius. You're on mute. I believe you're on mute, Mr. Sirius.
I don't know if I'm mute. Okay, can you hear me now, Chairman?
Yes, yes.
I went back on mute again. I just love this stuff. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you, Chairman, for holding this hearing. This is a very important hearing, not only for our district, but for America. And I also want to thank the witnesses for being here today. You know, I'm a big rail person. I believe that rail is critical to this country, especially when you come from the districts that we come from, the chairman and I. It's so congested. So over the years, I have been very involved with light rail. And we have a light rail in Hudson County. At its peak, it used to move about 45,000 people. But it's done to the area that is so important. It moves people from north to south. It ties into the ferry. It ties into the train stations that go into the city. And it moves people a lot quicker than by road, believe me. So can you, I guess, Ms. Valentine, can you speak about the investment in light rail that supports growth and efficiency in intercity passenger rail?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I love light rail, by the way. We do have light rail over in Norfolk, Virginia. And as far as moving people within an urban area, I believe it is a very effective way to do that. What we're really trying to do with the rail initiative today is that intercity passenger rail to really make those connections, you know, along major corridors and still try to connect with, you know, communities along the way. Most of our applications for light rail come from jurisdictions. We have not received as many applications for that. It goes through a program called Smart Scale, where we actually do a cost benefit analysis for our, you know, for various opportunities. And so that's something that we are going to follow more closely. But I'm really grateful to hear that you really like and appreciate it as well.
Believe me, I've been very involved with it for about 25 years, even before I got elected to office. But one of the things that I found out when I was vice chair of the Circle of Mobility in my area is the idea of the cost analysis. Obviously, if you don't have the ridership, light rail doesn't work. So you will always have to subsidize with big amounts of money a light rail. So light rail, I don't think it's for every part of the country. I don't think it's, you know, it has to be, I feel that it is for the areas that are densely populated so you can move people around. So, you know, sometimes people love to come to the district and see the light rail. And they say, oh, maybe we can have this in our area. And I tell them, well, if you don't have the ridership, I don't think you're going to be able to sustain a light rail system. But, you know, subsidies help. And what I can tell you is that with the light rail, I've seen the development on the waterfront in New Jersey facing New York City. It is amazing what it has done to that area. So in terms of creating jobs, in terms of people moving in terms of people spending money in the area, it is a transformation of an area that has been there. There's an old area where people used to come in and when they first came to this country and settled. I mean, you can't afford living in Hoboken today. It has transformed the whole area.
May I just add this one point that when we first launched the intercity passenger rail, Virginia-sponsored passenger rail back in 2009, it really started with a pilot. It was $17 million for 3 years from Lynchburg, Virginia, into DC, into the new Northeast corridor. And I had to make sure that we had 51,000 riders, and we didn't know if we were going to be able to sustain it. And in that first year, we had 125,000 passengers. It always exceeded expectations for ridership and profitability. And today, that rail service, which we now extend over to Roanoke, and we're working to get it to Blacksburg, Christiansburg, is really one of our most profitable rail services. In fact, probably in the country. It doesn't even need a subsidy because they're able to generate that kind of ridership. Sometimes when we are looking at solutions targeted solutions. These are the investments we can make to really tie in those connections between centers and between business centers. So your point is
Thank
very
you very much. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, sir. Next, we will hear from Mr. Burchett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you and congratulations on chairing this great subcommittee. I want to thank you for something you do. Seems like every time I'm on the floor giving a floor speech, you are there as well. And you're always, as a friend of mine who's passed away, was very famous in our community, a man named Alex Haley used to say, find the good and praise it. And dadgummit, every day you're down there praising somebody in your district, some person that maybe won't ever get any Nobel Peace Prize, but dadgummit, they're doing something for our community. And I want to thank you for doing that, because that means a whole lot to a lot of people when you do that. So thank you. It does not go unnoticed. I just want you to know that, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for recognizing that.
Yes, sir. I think we'd probably all be better served if we did a little more finding some good and praising it than we are running each other down. Ms. Kraska, we have 4 short line railroads that run through Tennessee's 2nd Congressional District, the area I'm fortunate enough to represent, and nearly 30 of those operate across the state. And you might have answered this before at the end of somebody else's questions, but I wanted to lead with this. What unique challenges do short lines face, and how can Congress help improve those operational flexibility for those small businesses? I believe you're muted, ma'am. Or maybe like a lot of people in this body, you just don't want to talk to me.
No, I'm more than happy to talk to you. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
How can we get off your back and make your life a little easier?
That is an interesting question, one that I was actually not expecting. Regulations are difficult for us, and that would probably be the top area.
Could you name me a couple of those? I know I'm kind of putting you on the spot, but just a couple maybe we could address at some point.
Okay, well, let if you don't mind, if I could get back to you with the priorities on those. But in terms of other items as well, you know, to make it easier for us, truck size and weight, grants, would be helpful for us to build our infrastructure. In terms of the specific regulations, we have a fair amount of reporting that is challenging. I don't know the specifics, but I hear my safety individual complaining about a new regulation that is going to go ahead and create hours and hours of labor and reporting. So I think I would request that, you know, when new things are put in place, that there be a look at how much work it involves for us as we are small companies. I know many things are phased through the short lines after they go through the class ones. But I will get back to you specifically.
Yes, ma'am. I appreciate that. It's Tim Burchett from 2nd Congressional District in Tennessee. I would really appreciate that. Mr. Williams, the Federal Highway Administration expects U.S. Freight shipments to increase 30%, over the next 20 years. And what are railways like yours doing to prepare for this increase in freight shipping? As you know, in my colleague Congressman Cohen's office, in his district, Bnsf Railway operates over there in Western Tennessee. And I'm wondering what regulatory changes do you need to see that we could make to better serve our nation?
Yeah, There are several that I outlined in my written testimony, but one specific, and it's important to me as the leader of our intermodal business, and this is where we expect a lot of those trucks to find their rail opportunity, is that we're able to get through the permitting process at a pace enough to allow us to invest, especially in the endpoints of our network. And our network connects the Mississippi River basin through Chicago all the way to all of the West Coast ports. And so the efficiency of intermodal along those long haul corridors between the Midwest and the West Coast, and being able to invest in additional safe and clean lift capacity in those locations as this demand pace ramps up, I think is going to be very important.
All right. Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, yield back the remainder of my time and do some good today, sir.
Thank you. I appreciate the comments and look forward to continue working with you. Next on the roster is Mr. Wilson. You have 5 minutes. I'm sorry. Ms. Wilson. I apologize. Ms. Wilson. Oh my goodness. My friend.
You don't know your best friend? How are you today?
I'm gonna pay for that one.
Thank
Where's your
Where's your
hat?
I'm so proud.
Where's your hat?
Well, I'm voting virtually today, so I decided not to wear a hat, but I don't see no red tie.
Oh, that's right.
I see a red tie. So
Okay.
congratulations on your first meeting, your first hearing. I'm so very proud of you. I want to say to everyone, thank you for your testimonies. This is quite interesting. Freight and passenger rail service plays an integral role in my district's economy and across our nation. Miami was a town of fewer than 300 people before the arrival of Henry Flagler's Railroad. Today, Miami is one of our nation's largest cities and a leader in global commerce. Services like Metro Rail, Tri-Rail, Amtrak, and Brightline help mitigate congestion while reducing greenhouse emissions. My constituents and I have experienced the immeasurable benefits of the industry, and we appreciate it in South Florida. The rail industry also is a glowing example of the strength of unions and the union's ability to provide a path to the middle class, even for those without a college degree. And we tout the benefits of the rail industry. We also must ensure that safety efforts keep pace with growth and innovation. I look forward to working with my colleagues to improve America's rail system and safety efforts to meet our environmental and economic needs. With that, I have a few questions. Mr. Reagan, as a co-sponsor of the PRO Act and strong supporter of unions, I have worked so hard to help keep this legislation passing during the past 2 Congresses. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to speak with you today. And although the PRO Act does not impact rail workers specifically, it will still bring unionization to other sectors. Please share with us the benefits that unionization brings to its workers.
Thank you, Congresswoman, and I appreciate your strong support of the PRO Act. While, as you noted, it does not affect rail or aviation workers, it would be a huge benefit to our economy and to workers throughout the country. From our perspective, from TTD's perspective, we represent an industries, including rail, that are highly unionized, and because of that, these are jobs that are a pathway to the middle class. They have higher wages and benefits. They are industries where truly we have a middle class job base, and that's true across transportation, rail, aviation, transit, maritime, and it's not an accident. It's because of the strong unionization in those industries. It's because of the strong collective bargaining rights, and it's something that should be afforded to workers throughout our economy and throughout the country.
So how can Congress work with the rail industry to effectively develop and deploy green solutions?
Certainly, we support. We think that many of our transportation modes, the investments that we can make in transportation, are inherently green. We think rail is a green industry, and it's one that we frankly should see more federal investment in as we make sure that we can expand passenger rail access, that we can expand, commuter rail access, things like this. So these are green investments that Congress can make, but we need to actually make the investments. It needs to be a situation where Congress is setting the course and making those initial investments into these industries so that we are going to have the passengers come. We're going to see the increase in freight. But it needs to have that initial investment. Otherwise, we're not going to see the benefits unless people are willing to take that first step to make the investments that are needed.
So we will certainly be helping you with that. Ms. Valentine, in your testimony, you called on Congress to consider a capital grant program to help expand passenger rail in your state. In Miami, Brightline is privately funded, and although we do have safety challenges, what impact could a capital grant program have in helping states and localities expand passenger rail? That's important for Miami.
Yes, yes. And we really appreciate everything that's being done in Miami from a multimodal perspective. One of the things that passenger rail is really lacking is a long-term sustainable source of funding that would allow states to make investments in larger passenger rail initiatives or a program of projects. It's allowing us to create a vision and being able to implement it. Even this piece that I'm bringing to you today, we have put together with state, regional resources, working with partners, trying to put together a financial plan that works. If we could work with Congress on capital funding that would be sustainable over a longer period of time, I believe we could build out a national rail network with meaningful connections in a far more accelerated way.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I yield back.
I'd like to thank the gentlelady for yielding back, and good to see her. I next go to Mr. Johnson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll start with Mr. Williams. And Mr. Williams, I suspect you know as well as I do, if not better, that the United States' competitive advantage in the global grain and soybean markets comes so much because of our ability to quickly and efficiently move product from the Midwest, ag products from the Midwest, to our ports. And I know BNSF has invested a lot of money in trying to make that more efficient. I think in the report you included as a part of your testimony, you noted y'all have invested $3.5 billion in 2019. And I'm sure a lot of that did help with agricultural transport. But aside from the private investment that the railroads are making, should we be looking at any particular role for the federal government in maintaining that American superiority and competitiveness in those grain markets vis-a-vis the efficient shipment?
Well, I appreciate the question. Our agriculture business is certainly core to our franchise. And I agree with the point that our rail system helps support the comparative advantage that the agriculture and farming community has in the global economy. And I would really say, just let us keep doing what we're doing with our private investment. We've invested significantly to support the bulk ag franchise, and we've also opened up some new facilities to support agriculture loading and containers. And again, working through that private investment has been a successful model for us, and it really has positioned our agriculture business quite well.
So you mentioned containers, and I thought in your testimony you did a good job of walking through the interconnectedness of the system. And I think y'all moved 5 million intermodal shipments last year, which is just mind-blowing. I mean, we're getting increasing reports of ocean carriers refusing to carry ag products, which means that we're getting empty containers hauled back to Asia from American ports. Is that impacting you all at all? I mean, is it backing up? Is it disrupting in any way your network?
I have read about that occurrence, and our intermodal contracts are directly with carriers, whether it's domestic truckload companies on the domestic side of our intermodal business or the shipping lines on the international side. And so, I mean, we are moving what is tendered to us by the shipping lines to support the westbound movement of both loaded and empty volumes back. So I wouldn't say that there's anything there that's inherently disrupting our rail operations.
So you haven't seen any particular change in your volumes, particularly with regard to empties moving back to the Midwest?
Empty container loadings are up. That is a fact. And there's certain locations, and I would say we still do have a very robust operation loading agricultural commodities in containers as well. But it is a fact that the empty westbound movements are up.
Well, if you see, Mr. Williams, any bigger, more substantial, more material changes in that, I mean, certainly let the committee know. I know a number of members of Congress on both sides of the aisle are really following this ocean carrier situation. A question for Ms. Kraska, and I thought you did a really good job, particularly in the attachment to your testimony, walking through the incredible benefits of the 45G tax benefit, how it's improved safety, improved investment. I also thought your testimony did a good job walking through specific improvements that could be made to the infra program to make it more usable for short lines. With regard to 45G, the short line rail tax credit, is there anything Congress should be looking at to make that even more effective for y'all?
I certainly appreciate the fact that Congress had made it permanent, and keeping it such would be a huge boon to us. As a small business owner, one of the things that I have to say is prior to that, what I had done was on an annual basis provide 2 budgets for my company, one with 45G, one without 45G. I'm happy to have it in place as long as it is in place. Of course, I would appreciate, the dollar amounts being increased, but knowing that you have something and that you can rely on it is more important.
Very good. That
So-
makes sense. Thanks, Ms. Kraska. And thank you for your testimony calling out the over 700-mile-long RCNP line in South Dakota. I enjoyed reading that, of course. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding back. Next, we will have Mr. Garcia.
Thank you, Chairman Payne and Ranking Member Crawford. And of course, thank you to all the witnesses that have appeared today. I represent Chicago, the busiest freight rail hub in the country. And each day, over 500 freight trains and over 750 passenger trains move through my city. Nearly 25% of all freight trains pass through Chicago, and our Union Station serves as a corridor gateway to Amtrak's entire national network. To Mr. Greg Regan. Mr. Regan, the railroad sector was historically, has been an extremely important industry to the city of Chicago. My district is home to over 700 rail employees with thousands more in surrounding districts. I'm concerned about your comments on the loss of good union jobs in the freight rail industry, given that these well-paid jobs have supported Chicago families for decades. Can you explain what's causing these job losses?
Sure, and thank you so much for your question, Congressman. I do think it's a gear. It is in my view, a Wall Street mindset that's coming to the freight railroad industry, as opposed to a longer term sort of sustainable growth that we've seen for a long time. It is frankly more of a focus on short term returns, and that is something that we've seen from a reduction of both the number of people that are being employed by the railroads, as well as, frankly, sort of changes in how they're operating for the shippers. So we, as I said before, our primary focus is on the impact of safety of this operating model. We want to make sure that our members and the communities that these railroads are operating through are being done so in a safe manner. And so we're just going to continue to focus on that and make sure that they're being appropriately regulated to maintain safety.
Thank you. Secretary Valentine, on February 24th, the U.S. Department of Transportation issued a 30-day notice adjusting the rail passenger transportation liability cap as required by by the Fixing America Surface Transportation FAST Act by raising it from 294 million to 322 million. The current state of the passenger rail liability insurance market is poor, and there are limited to no domestic insurance providers that offer this coverage. The situation has led to high premiums to commuter railroads and has required commuter railroads to purchase complex insurance tiers and from international markets instead of a single insurance policy to meet the liability cap. This can be extremely expensive and somewhat cumbersome to implement. Could you please describe how the passenger railroad liability cap has impacted commuter railroads in Virginia to your understanding, and also what can the federal government do in the long term to address the insurance markets to provide more cost-effective insurance policies for American commuter railroads?
Well, hello, thank you. I was actually just being briefed yesterday on some of the impacts of that increase in the liability cap. Certainly, it's an issue of funding and making sure everyone can afford it. But my understanding is that the greater issue is access to getting the insurance in time for the deadline, which I believe is March 27th. And so I know that there's a coalition of commuter railroads working with our federal partners to see if there could be some action taken to either extend it by executive order or perhaps some correct congressional authorization to allow the commuter railroads to secure that additional liability insurance in time to meet that. And then over the longer term, working with the insurance industry, as you have alluded to, how can we, address this issue, prepare for it, and make sure that all of our railroads are protected and able to provide service.
Thank you. And Mr. Williams, turning to you, given that BNSF has already purchased 500 Tier 4 locomotives, what do you think can be done to encourage the further adoption of Tier 4 locomotives at BNSF and industry-wide, of course?
30 seconds.
Well, our customers are demanding that we continue to press on environmental sustainability. And so I think our customers are going to be our biggest motivation to continue to deploy and explore sustainable technologies, including the sustainability of our locomotive fleet. But we do have the newest and cleanest burning locomotive fleet in North America.
Great, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman for yielding back. Now we will have Mr. Nels.
Mr. Payne, congratulations on your position as chairman of this subcommittee, and I look forward to working with you and the other members.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir. My comments and question are directed at Mr. Williams. I want to thank you, Mr. Williams, for being with us today. I would like to commend BNSF on the safety record. Your written testimony details a significant reduction in rail accidents over the past 2 decades, in addition to an impressive safety record for your employees. So I want to commend you for that, and I want to say you're moving in the right direction. I believe one could contribute this success to your proactive approach to innovation and capital reinvestment. I know that BNSF has a huge presence in the great state of Texas, and you're certainly very visible in my congressional district, District 22. So my question, you mentioned in your testimony the recent cold weather event in Texas impacted normal train operations. Could you elaborate more on the impact this had on BNSF?
Yes, thank you for the question and the comments. And we do prioritize safety as the top of our decision tree when we're making decisions at BNSF. As a Fort Worth resident, and I'm in Fort Worth today, I had personal experience with the storm in Texas, but it certainly had impacts to our operation. And anytime there's a disruptive weather event, especially one as significant as the storms we had a couple of weeks ago, it has impacts on the entire North American network because these freight networks are so interconnected. You have rail cars that are deployed on trains going into the weather event, but you also have shipping containers that are queuing to get to facilities that may have been closed for a couple of days due to the outage. And all of that slows down the cycle time of the assets that need to be redeployed back to high demand places, for example, the ports on the West Coast, to get those next loads. And so weather events like that do have impact broadly to freight networks.
Very well. Are there any federal policies that we should be aware of in this subcommittee that could maybe alter for you to have a quicker return to normal operations? Are there any issues that need to be addressed on our side?
I'm not aware of anything new, but I do understand that when we have events like that, our transportation team works with the FRA on waivers that allow us to safely redeploy assets or recover quickly. And so that temporary waiver process, when we have a big disruptive event, to help us safely get back on track, continuing that, I think would be important.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman for yielding back. Next, we will have the gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Strickland.
Great. Thank you, Chairman Payne and Ranking Member Crawford. As our witnesses and many of our colleagues have shared today, the Federal Highway Administration predicts that total U.S. freight shipments will increase by 30% in the next 20 years. And with nearly 140,000 workers in our rail industry, we know that so much of our economic success and recovery hinges upon the success of our rail system and on the employment and safety of our rail workers. And since I represent Washington State in a district with key roles in trade that cannot be overstated, I'd like to start with Mr. Williams of BNSF. And BNSF, of course, is no stranger to Washington State. So as your testimony noted, Mr. Williams, over 40,000 marine vessel trips go through the Ballard Locks and Lake Washington Ship Canal each year to and from the Puget Sound as a big corridor, as you know. And there's also the Salmon Bay Rail Bridge, which is a key part of our state's economy. So can you just speak to us about the value of investing in rail infrastructure projects like this bridge, and the impact that it could have on our state and our economic competitiveness? And then secondly, please let us know what you're doing to look to the future and your vision on the economy and ensuring that resiliency and environmental efforts and safety are part of what we do. Thanks.
Thank you for the question, and thank you for having me today, Congresswoman Strickland. And I probably could use the entirety of your remaining time to talk about the Salmon Bay Bridge, because it's such an interesting part of the engineering history of our railroad there on the north side of Seattle. But as you noted, it's a bridge that raises up and down to support both freight and commuter trains, as well as the marine traffic that goes in and out of the Puget Sound. And so it's an old piece of technology. There's a significant amount of community benefit. And so think about it in terms of a public-private partnership. If the bridge was stuck up, freight would have to move on the highways, commuters would have to find another route. If the bridge was stuck down, the marine traffic would be suspended. And so working out a long-term solution to that, as you know, and I know you're very familiar with the project, is very important. And then long-term outlook on the economy. I mean, I think all of the West Coast ports, and certainly we work very closely with the Northwest Seaport Alliance on trade, but our economy international trade is so important to our economy, and so continued investments around those connector points, and certainly enabling us to continue to aggressively invest in our intermodal network, I think are important factors for how trade impacts the U.S. economy.
Great. And then I want to switch now to passenger rail. And as you know, this hits close to home for us in the 10th district. And there have been big strides made in positive train control, with railroads meeting the end of 2020 deadline for implementation. But there's still so much more that we can do, not just in one state, but really across the entire system. So can you talk about what we're doing to look even beyond positive train control to keep our workers and passengers safe? And how does that tie into our economic success?
So PTC is one of many risk mitigation efforts in the rail industry, and certainly on our network. But the advancement of PTC, no doubt, is an important measure. We were excited to be, I would say, a pioneer in PTC before it was a federal mandate. And we've gone significantly beyond just the mandated corridors for PTC to a point where I think it's 93%, it's in my testimony, of the freight that moves on our network moves on a subdivision that's controlled by PTC. So, I know I've said it multiple times today, but safety is a priority. I think you've seen numbers that bear out there's continued improvement in safety over time in the rail industry. We're very motivated to protect our employees and continue that good path. And PTC is just one of many measures in our safety program.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding back. Next, we have Ms. Steele.
Thank you, Chairman, Ranking Member, and the witnesses today. I think it's important that as a committee, we have conversations like this about the future of rail in our country. As a California taxpayer, I want to use this opportunity today to talk about a rail project is expected to cost residents more than $100 billion with a B. Construction on the California high-speed rail project started in 2015. In 2010, the Obama administration gave the project $2 billion with a requirement to have the first segment operational by 2022. It's been 6 years and construction has barely inched along. Meanwhile, a 2018 report from the California State Auditor referenced the high-speed rail authorities' flawed decision-making and poor contract management, which contributed to billions in cost overruns and delays in construction. This project is a waste of taxpayer dollars. In 2019, Governor Newsom shortened the project by more than 200 miles. I don't think any more federal money should go to this project. I introduced a bill that prevents more taxpayer dollars from funding this train to nowhere. I have taken high-speed rail from Osaka to Tokyo so often when I was raised in Japan. It's very efficient and cost-effective, but we don't have the infrastructure here to support a bullet train like this in California. And unfortunately, this has been figured out in a real time at taxpayers' expense. To be clear, I don't oppose all high-speed rail projects, but I am very concerned about protecting private landowners and taxpayer dollars. Having said that, I want to ask just one really simple question to Ms. Kraska, that there are so many conversations about high-speed rail in the country. And I want to ask you how you believe future high-speed rail projects can be successful while at the same time protect taxpayer dollars in the United States.
I'm a small short line, 150 miles, and we do not have any passenger trains. It's possible at some point in the future that something like that might happen. But I don't think it's particularly likely in my time frame for my area. So having said that, basically, I think passenger transportation, high speed, is very desirable, but there needs to be the public-private partnership with all parties involved, making sure that the various aspects of it that are important that will contribute to the success of a program are in fact discussed and laid out in advance. I too have been on the bullet train, so I know exactly of what you speak. And I understand that, yes, for us to be successful here, the infrastructure would have to be further developed as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield my time.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding. Next, we have the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations on your maiden voyage as chair of this committee, and thank you for holding this hearing.
I'd like to
Mr.
thank the gentleman.
Williams, rail is one of the most climate responsible transit options available to us. And freight railroads account for 28% of freight volume, but only 0.6% of total US greenhouse gas emissions, and just 2.1% of transportation related greenhouse gas emissions, according to EPA data. We know that the pace of climate change is rapid, it's real, and the crisis is only worsening. So the time to take bold action is now. Your testimony highlights the many environmental advantages of rail. How urgently do we need to expand our national rail network in order to have a more positive impact on climate change?
Well, I think you pointed to the inherent underlying benefit of just rail as it exists today. And customers are more aggressively seeking rail solutions in their supply chains. And so we're very motivated to expand the capacity on our network to be able to handle more of our customers' freight. And so certainly the ability to permit the competitive rail projects for expansion is very important. And then our customers are also driving us not to just rest on our laurels that rail as it exists today is inherently environmentally benefit, but continuing to push on greener technologies in our operation, whether it's the locomotive fleet, the cranes that operate at our intermodal facilities, the trucks that go in and out of our intermodal facilities, and so forth. But I think that the biggest opportunity in terms of expanding rail is enabling us to invest in permit projects to grow as our customers' demand increases.
Thank you. Do you believe that state and local governments generally appreciate the environmental aspects of or the environmental impact, positive environmental impact in terms of their plans on expanding their rail networks?
I think it's very mixed, and we've had challenges permitting very green projects. Certainly in Southern California, we've spent the better part of 15 years trying to permit what would have been the greenest intermodal facility in the country and have very significant environmental benefits locally. But it's still getting through the permitting process has been a challenge. So I would say, our experience is mixed on that.
Thank you. The inclusion of women and minority-owned small businesses in the expansion of our national freight network is imperative, in my view. And this means preserving and strengthening the DOT's Disadvantaged Business Enterprise Program. Mr. Reagan, do you have an opinion as to the importance of disadvantaged business enterprises to state and national economic development?
Oh, absolutely. We are entirely supportive of supporting of federal programs that will enhance minority and women-owned businesses, and we think that the federal government rightfully plays a strong role in making sure that we can have more economic opportunity for different communities in the freight railroad industry. So whatever we can do to be supportive of these programs and to provide more investment and opportunity, we will do that.
Thank you. As any witness can answer this question, as we prepare for the introduction of this new surface transportation reauthorization bill, how can this committee further prioritize robust rail investments?
I'm happy to step in there. Congressman, I think that there is a clear desire, if you're looking at the passenger side, for instance, there is a clear desire from the American people for more and expanded passenger rail service. I know there were some critical comments about high-speed rail earlier, and I think there are inevitably going to be hurdles when you're the first to make that big investment. But clearly, as other countries have demonstrated, it's possible, and we are frankly just falling behind and not making the investments to make high-speed rail and real high-speed rail possible in this country. So we need to continue those efforts. The other thing I think when it comes to freight, focusing on intermodal investments is an important part of that. I think one of the biggest concerns that you hear from ports is that there isn't enough rail access so that we're connecting our maritime shipping with our rail shipping. And we need to make the investments in intermodal facilities with the appropriate federal protections, labor protections, a priority here to make sure that the entire system is operating appropriately. So I think there's a huge amount of opportunity here, and there's a huge amount of opportunity both from an economic perspective, a jobs perspective, and a passenger and user perspective. And we just need to have that investment from the federal level to make it a possibility.
Thank you. Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired, but I appreciate his line of questioning is very important. So thank the gentleman.
Thank you.
Next, we have Mr. Fitzpatrick. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to all the panelists for joining us today. We really appreciate all your service. My questions actually are for Mr. Reagan. Sir, it's very good to see you. If you could just, and you know, if you've already answered this, forgive me, but I wanted you to expand on the record, so we have it on the record, the importance specifically of the freight rail workers, specifically the freight rail workers with respect to their roles keeping our economy going during the pandemic, because I think they get overlooked a lot, and I want that on the record. If you could just share any additional thoughts that you haven't already shared.
Absolutely. Thank you, Congressman. Good to see you as well. Freight rail workers, they have been frontline workers keeping our economy going throughout this pandemic, making sure that we have medical supplies, food throughout the country. This is they have provided that link that has been necessary throughout all of this. One thing that unfortunately is true is that there's a constant push to cut back on, there's the push on crew size, there's the push on PSR that have undermined, I think, the workers' role in this overall economy. And for us, we think that there are going to be necessary regulations to make sure that there's a balance in the safety and balance in the workforce concerns as we move forward and grow this industry moving in the future. So we really think that there is an opportunity here to not only be one of the most forward-looking and advanced freight systems in the country, but also one that supports a middle-class workforce that is key to bringing our economy back.
Thanks. And as our rail system faces a lot of challenges, for sure. According to STB, there are currently about 113,000 Class 1 freight railroad employees, which is down from about 152,000 less than 4 years ago. Could you share with our committee what Congress can do, what the rail industry can do to ensure that we have a strong workforce going forward?
I think Congress has a number of tools to create and promote good freight jobs. We strongly support a robust surface transportation bill that can address the crumbling infrastructure across our country that is slowing both freight and passenger rail. And we also need to look at policies that will increase intermodal rail connectors at ports and harbors, as I mentioned earlier, and just put the investment there to make sure that the industry can continue to grow.
Mr. Fitzpatrick,
Sorry, I'm on mute.
I think you're on mute.
Yes, sir. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry.
Oh, thank you, sir. I ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions. Without objection, so ordered. Next, we will have the gentlelady from Nevada, Ms. Titus, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask Secretary Valentine a couple of questions, if I could. I represent Las Vegas, Secretary Valentine, and we haven't had passenger rail service there since the late 1990s when Amtrak ended their long-distance Desert Wind service. That particular train came to Las Vegas in the middle of the night. Now, knowing Las Vegas, that may not seem like such a deterrent, but looking at other railroad studies, we know that that's not the best time to encourage passenger travel. Also in Las Vegas, we welcome about 42 million travelers a year. 1/5 of them come from California, and 85% of those drive on I-15, which has gotten very congested. It's the highway that connects Los Angeles to Las Vegas. So that, for all of those reasons, it makes sense to expand passenger rail service. We're now in the process of moving forward with what they are calling the Bright Line West project. And that's trying to build a new private passenger service between the two areas, which will help reduce both traffic and emissions. You mentioned some of the work that you've done reviving the southeastern corridor, near the speed rail proposal for that area. I wonder if you could talk about some of the things you've learned or best practices or some of the things we could use to do the same thing in the Southwest. You also mentioned potential federal support in the form of a capital investment program. Wonder if that can be used as a public-private partnership as well.
Oh, thank you so much. And congratulations on all your work out in Las Vegas. So anyway, I did have to laugh when we were talking about the nighttime. You know, our our project, in my mind, is really the first step in creating a Southeast high-speed corridor. We have to build the bridge in order to expand access, and we need to be able to begin separating passenger and freight. And even before that is able to occur, building sidings and creating the ability to move both. We took a lot of lessons from a study called the DC to RVA. Again, it's the first part of that high-speed Southeast corridor. For us, it was recommended that we take an incremental approach rather than having a large $100 billion project. We were doing it in increments. And so this is a $3.7 billion approach, which is still going to help us over 10 years create hourly service between Richmond and DC. It was recommended that we use existing infrastructure and right of way. So in our negotiations with CSX, we are acquiring 386 miles of right of way and 223 miles of track. We are also purchasing, as a part of this, an S line. It's abandoned. It goes down into Ridgeway, North Carolina, from Petersburg, Virginia, just south of Richmond. Because it's abandoned, we have a lot of opportunity for development for future phases, for even higher speed rail. And we actually included part of Buckingham Branch. It's an east-west freight corridor that we would like to upgrade and protect for east-west connection. All of these were incremental steps using existing right-of-way and tracks and achieving higher speeds where it was achievable. There are times when topography and different elements come into play. And so we're trying to go for the highest speeds that we are able to achieve. But what we're really delivering, and I think you know this from your question, is reliable, predictable transportation. We want to be able to deliver ridership on time and with regular performance. So we are really striving in all of our negotiations to make performance and reliability the most important target.
Well, thank you very much. Did you look at the possibility of development incentives around potential stations as a way to contribute to funding?
That is a longer term objective. At this point, we're really just focused on building out the rail corridor and what is possible. We have our stations, but that is not a part of this initiative.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I will now recognize each member for 5 minutes for questions, and I will start by recognizing Mr. Auchincloss first.
Thank you. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here today to speak about rail and the economic power that it portends. Secretary Valentine, you put it well in your written testimony that in 2009, rail reached 49% of Virginians, 53% of jobs. Today, it reaches 77% of the population, 88% of jobs. In other words, quote, not enough. And in my district and in Massachusetts, we also have a lot of work to do. South Coast Rail in my district is critical to two major cities, Taunton and Fall River, which along with New Bedford are the only major cities within 50 miles of Boston that do not currently have commuter rail access. It's going to boost economic development. It's going to boost access to jobs and services. And yet it took 30 years to get South Coast Rail fully funded and to break ground on its construction. Secretary Valentine, it's my understanding that the Virginia Department of Transportation has been a pioneer in using smart scale, which I know Transportation for America and the University of Wisconsin-Madison have helped foment. With a project like Smart Scale that evaluates transportation infrastructure by how much it contributes to access to jobs and services, do you expect that rail projects like South Coast Rail and passenger rail in general would be easier to fund and would be prioritized faster by virtue of connecting more people to jobs and services?
I believe elements could certainly be, smart scale is based on safety and accessibility, environmental impact, land use, various factors, including economic development. We actually measure those factors and score them against the cost of implementing them. Our rail and transit projects actually do very well through our smart scale project, our smart scale program. The issue being for larger intercity passenger rail, commuter rail projects, it would far exceed what we are able to actually invest in a smart scale project. For Virginia, our last round was about $850 million. This year, through the passage of an omnibus transportation program, we have about $1.3 billion for the entire Commonwealth. So if we could use and leverage these funds with other sources, partners, federal dollars, to create a vision and a long-term sustainable investment in passenger rail, I believe we can accomplish what you're trying to accomplish.
And to make sure I'm understanding that, I'll frame it back to you. If the federal government under DOT was using a smart scale like evaluation that was looking at ROI for a given transportation project based on safety, as you said, but also connection to jobs and services, how much thicker the labor market gets, you think that funding that the federal government would match for states would tend to raise up commuter rail projects, passenger rail projects relative to highways?
Yeah, in my mind, I'm thinking, how do we leverage state and regional dollars and how do we leverage federal dollars? Imagine what we could do together. So yes, creating that cost benefit analysis, having skin in the game for everyone, but really it's that longer term sustainable investment that we really need to have to expand passenger rail. It's been quite an effort to put this $3.7 billion package together to initiate this phase.
Is smart scale measuring sustainability from an environmental perspective?
It's measuring the impact of a proposed project, various environmental factors. So it's for a project. My wording back to you is really the sustainable investment of the federal government in these programs. If we could have it over a longer term,
I see.
Where the longer over a longer period where we could actually deliver larger projects and a program of projects where you create that connectivity. But again, it's leveraging what we have at the state with what the federal government is able to provide. And I think we could actually work together to create much more of a system for that connectivity that you're looking within in your district.
Well, and here I want to reference my colleague, Congressman Moulton's National Rail Plan, which would, I think, provide that sustainability, that predictability, and I expect would incorporate much of the criteria of smart scale to create a national funding paradigm for rail. And that's why that initiative that he has spearheaded, I think, is so critically important to my state and to the nation. And I yield back my time.
Thank you.
Thank you, and I will now recognize Mr. Malinowski. Mr. Malinowski might not be with us still, so we'll go to recognizing Ms. Napolitano.
Thank you, and I would like to add my congratulations to the chair for the first hearing, and I have a few questions. Pardon me.
Ms. Napolitano, you might be on mute. Ms. Napolitano, we'll come back to you after we fix your audio, and now I will recognize Mr. Stanton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm here today to discuss a critical infrastructure project, the Rio de Flag Flood Protection Project, and how local and federal infrastructure investments interact with freight rail. The 100-year floodplain of the Rio de Flag covers large portions of the city of Flagstaff, Arizona. Flagstaff's downtown business district and historic neighborhoods stand to be seriously impacted by a major flood event. And for generations, the city has been in a battle to prevent this from happening. A significant flood event could damage 1,500 structures, including homes and businesses in the city, valued at more than $916 million, and cause $93 million in economic damages, a total impact of more than $1 billion. The Bnsf Southern Transcontinental Main Line, which is critically important to Bnsf to move freight from Chicago to Los Angeles, runs through the heart of Flagstaff, and it too is located in the same 100-year floodplain. As a result, it has the potential to experience serious negative impact to its operations in the case of a major flood. Congress, with bipartisan support, authorized and funded the Rio de Flag Flood Protection Project. The existing undersized channel that needs improvement crosses under the Bnsf corridor, and portions of the project are planned to be constructed on Bnsf property, adjacent to the main line. Flagstaff has been working on the design of this project with the Corps of Engineers and Bnsf for more than 20 years. The total cost of the Rio de Flag Flood Project is estimated at $122 million. In fiscal year 2020, the Corps awarded the final $52 million in federal funds needed to complete its construction. The city is ready to proceed, but coordination has been challenging due to BNSF's approval process and the level of mitigation that BNSF is requesting. Unfortunately, the anticipated mitigation costs, $70 to $100 million based on early estimates, are costs the city simply can't afford. These costs, which are in addition to what the community has already committed to the flood protection project, risk significantly delaying its construction or worse, ending the project altogether. In addition to the flood project, the city has several other projects in development funded entirely with local resources, including grade separated rail crossings, a large overpass, a pedestrian tunnel in an active trespassing area. These projects will improve rail safety and reduce vehicle traffic at existing crossings, all of which will benefit BNSF's operations and support construction of its third mainline track. The city and the Army Corps have expressed concerns that the cost and scale of the requested mitigation for the flood protection project are vastly disproportionate to BNSF's operation and does not incorporate the benefits BNSF will receive from community rail improvements and the flood protection project. If federal funding cannot be obligated for Rio de Flag project due to the lack of agreement on appropriate level of mitigation, the project will lose these funds and lose more than $30 million that the city of Flagstaff has already invested in this critical project. I believe we all share the same goals: permanent flood protection for families and businesses in Flagstaff, increased rail safety, and economic opportunity for both the city of Flagstaff and BNSF. So it's my hope that the necessary approvals can be advanced and that efforts to reach resolution on mitigation can proceed expeditiously to keep this critical flood protection project viable so both Flagstaff and BNSF can reap the benefits. Mr. Williams, I look forward to continue to work with BNSF and the City of Flagstaff on this important infrastructure project. I have several questions that I will submit for the record and appreciate your prompt reply. And in the time remaining, I would certainly welcome any comments you may like to make. Thank you very much.
Well, you very appropriately recognize the importance of our line through Flagstaff on our network, and that route supports not only local, but certainly on the order of 80 or 90 intermodal trains a day that serve all points east from Texas to the southeast to the upper Midwest. I am not familiar with the details of where this particular project stands. I understand that we're working toward a mutually agreeable solution and look forward to following up with your office on the particulars.
Thank you very much. I look forward to working closely with you, and I yield back.
Thank you, and I now recognize Mr. Balderson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for being here. My question is for Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams, thank you for participating in the hearing today and provide information on the current state of the rail industry. Mr. Williams, my first question, last summer, this committee marked up and passed H.R. 2, the Invest in American Act. This bill included a provision that would implement a 10-minute time limit for trains blocking public grade crossings. This provision would have applied penalties of up to $25,000, even for the first-time violations, for rail cars and trains that block a crossing for just 1 second over the 10-minute limit. The bill also directs the Department of Transportation to submit a report containing a national strategy to address block crossings. While this report is a good start, the bill would give the department up to 18 months to submit this strategy, while the penalties for block crossings would go into effect immediately. No one likes having their daily commute delayed or impacted because of blocked rail crossings, and I don't think solving this issue should be a partisan issue. It's important that this committee works with the entire rail industry to better understand how we can prevent block crossings moving forward. But I am concerned that a one-size-fits-all approach would force crews to make split-second decisions in order to meet the 10-minute requirement. Mr. Williams, can you share what BNSF is doing to address this issue, and how can the federal government work with you to prevent block crossings?
Thank you for your question, Congressman Balderson. And I can assure you, even rail employees don't like waiting at blocked crossings for trains. And I would say we have concern with a one-size-fits-all approach. And certainly the community value within BNSF is strong. Our employees live in these communities that we serve. But issues around block crossings handled locally, we think, is the best way. We have our local operating teams that deal with local officials, and there are unique circumstances in local communities. We think those problems should be solved there where they are locally.
Thank you. Is there anyone else that has thoughts on this issue? You may address it if you would like. Okay, seeing none, Madam Chair, I yield back my remaining time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and we're going to go back to Ms. Napolitano to see if she's available.
Can you hear me?
We can. Please go ahead.
Hello? All right. Thank you very much. I wanted to talk about Alameda-Gore East, which is the transit for railroads out of the LA port in Long Beach in Southern California. And they can also be a burden to my communities because it goes through all my communities. Many streets, routes to school, yards of residence, within the yards of many residences and businesses. And they create
Did we lose her or did we lose?
congestion. The rail has. Hello?
We can hear you now.
The impacts, mitigating the impacts by supporting grade separation projects, rail safety projects, including the employee reduction, and environmental improvement projects, to any of you.
Congressman, this is Tom Williams from Bnsf, and I apologize, but I don't know if it was just me or if all of us were not able to hear a good deal of the first part of your question, but I did hear it related to the trains that touch the port complex down in Los Angeles.
Well, yes, it is. Both ports create the traffic that goes through my whole district, the Locomotives East. And it does cause a lot of problems because it traverses through many of the cities that I represent. And there's congestion, there's idling for the cars, and it creates pollution. And there's safety issues with first responders not being able to get through. And now with the longer trains that are being proposed to go into Long Beach from either Texas or some other areas, it is important that we recognize that there has to be a solution for the communities, not just for the railroad and not just for the industries.
Recognize that, and thank you for this question, and agree that it is a very important issue. I know the Alameda corridor did address several grade separations, and that was a good example of a public-private partnership that helped support more efficient rail growth and helped take a lot of trucks off of the highway. We're very motivated to continuing to grow our on-dock rail presence, which will further hopefully reduce trucks that are on the highways in Southern California. And certainly, grade separation efforts are important to keep the trains moving and have less disruption to the commuter traffic flows as well.
But should some of the funding be directed to ameliorating these problems?
Funding in terms of grade separation?
And not only grade separations, the railroad safety and environmental projects.
Yeah, I mean, I do think grade separation efforts are a good opportunity for public-private partnerships and with the local communities.
What is the normal length of a train anymore? Because I remember the 1.5 mile train that came to my area a long time ago, probably about 6 years ago. And it came out of Texas to our ports in Long Beach and LA. And 1.5 miles was enough to put a lot of concern in my residents and in my cities. What is the normal length of those trains now?
Well, the normal length is certainly on our system less than 1.5 miles long. And I do want to assure you that we would never operate a train that wasn't safe. But longer train initiatives are an important part of our efficiency initiatives to stay competitive in this competitive freight transportation marketplace. And as we run longer trains, we also run fewer trains for the same amount of volume.
Yes, but what length of train is the maximum that you run?
Well, today, trains can run well in excess of 1.5 miles long on occasion. But the average length in terms of our system is less than 1.5 miles long.
Okay, and then some of the farmers in my area are saying that they're being denied access to exporting goods because of whether it's capacity or whether it's, I don't know what the reason is. Would you be able to address that?
Yeah, so I addressed this and touched on this with an earlier question, but we certainly work with the shipping lines to move whatever they tender to us. We're not container owners on the railroad. We work with carriers both on the international and domestic side. And, we're eager to move the volume that is tendered to us.
That's fine. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. Are there any further questions from members of the subcommittee? Seeing none, I would like to thank each of the witnesses for your testimony today. Your comments have been very informative and helpful. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objections, so ordered, the committee stands adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.